Now, okay, welcome to the next installment of our studies of the book of Joshua. And today we're going to go through many of the chapters. The book has really one message, right? It's about really two things, okay? The entire book is about two things. One thing is called conquest, and the second thing is called settlement, okay? And in the first, in chapters 9, the first 12 chapters, they go through the conquest, and we're going to read it. It's not anything that exciting. I mean, if you have a knack for geography, so then you can appreciate where they conquered and what they did. We know the map more or less, but here's what it says. It says, these are the kings that the children of Israel conquered on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So remember that, in the Torah, and actually this week's Parsha, the 2.5 tribes liked the eastern side of the Jordan River because they said it was very fertile ground and fertile land for their children and for their cattle, actually, they said. And Moshe yelled at them, but they promised that they would go into the land. They would fight for 7 years, and only after they finished the conquest of the land would they return to their chosen land on the east side of the Jordan River. That becomes de facto part of the land of Israel, the borders of the land of Israel. That, of course, today is a political issue because that's all of the country of Jordan. So there's a big debate about the west bank of the Jordan River, but this is talking about the east bank of the Jordan River. And hold on. Okay. So this is just a review. In verse 1, it talks about where they were on the eastern side of the Jordan River, all the way up to the Hermon Mountains. Basically, it's a whole width of the land of Israel. Verse 2, it's Sichon, the king of Emori, was settled by Israel. And then on the Yam HaMelach, we see in verse 3, it says the Sea of Salt, right, the Dead Sea. And the Gvul of Og Melech HaBashan is in the north. Really, it's like our Golan, okay? And Har Hermon, which is in the north of Israel. Moshe, in verse 6, Moshe conquered it and gave it as an inheritance to the Reuveni and the Gadi, the tribe of Reuven, the tribe of Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. And these are now and then in verse 7, it talks about the western side. This is what Joshua conquered on the western side, which basically, Israel. Yama is towards the west. Har and Shpela and Areva and Midbar and Negev, all the different locales of the state of Eretz Canaan. And the nations there were the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Yebusis. Okay, so that's 6 nations. One more called Girgashi. And then it gives a listing of all the kings that were conquered. The king of Jericho, the king of Ai, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmut, the king of Eglon. Altogether, 31 kings. There's another. Alina is joining us. Very nice. Okay. So now, that's chapter 12. It's a listing of all the kings. And look, already by chapter 13, Joshua's old. In other words, the first 12 chapters are the key to the conquest of the land of Canaan, the miracles and following the ways of God, the one mishap with Achan, who stole, and then they got in trouble with Ai, but then they corrected it. And the rest of the conquering of the major countries, the major nations in the land of Israel, 31 kings in all. Okay? Now look what happens in chapter 13. And Yoshua is old. And God says to Yoshua, you're old, and there's still more work to do. You still have to conquer the Plishtim territory, which is by the sea, like today, modern day Ashkelon and Ashdod, okay? And you need to go down the border to Egypt. And there are major city-states in Egypt, in the Philistines. And Mitaiman, all down the south, the Canaanites had that land. And in the north, all the way to the Hermon, there are certain pockets there that you didn't conquer. And now you separated, verse 7, the land into the 2.5 tribes that were on the eastern side. And they took their land, okay? And there it gives the borders of that land there. Now comes the most important section, verse 13. In verse 13, there's something that goes wrong. Now remember, Joshua is already old. And when you conquer the land, there are 2 types of conquering. Okay, one conquer is you defeat the army or you defeat the king. The second part is a little more complicated. It is the pockets of villages and fortresses and different nations, parts of the nation that are still there, even though the main kings were destroyed. People still hung around. And therefore, in verse 13, it says, but the Israelites failed to conquer the Geshurites and the Maachatites. And Geshur and Ma'akat stayed as a part, they lived in Israel till this very day. So if it's one little story, so then you say, okay, big deal. They conquered the rest of the country. The problem is we're going to see this over and over and over again. Let's see. Verse 14, the tribe of Levi, of course, they don't inherit, they don't conquer the land. They're just given cities in the land once the land is conquered. Moshe gives Reuven his borders, which we'd already discussed, which was the eastern side. And verse 22 says, Bilam ben Beor, the magician, they killed when they defeated him in the battle there. And here are all the borders of Reuven and of Gad and of half of the Shevet of Menashe. Okay? This gets a little technical and a little boring, and we're going to do it quickly just to go through it, but appreciating that we're not going to go through every detail of the borders of the land that they inherited. Chapter 14. The 9.5 remaining tribes, okay? And it explains that Joseph was 2 tribes. Remember, Jacob split in Joseph. His 2 sons inherited him, and therefore they became a double portion. They became Manasseh and Ephraim are instead of just Joseph, because Jacob rewarded him with a double portion, and therefore 2 of his sons each get a portion. Now, then a story takes place. Bnei Yehuda go to Joshua, the tribe of Judah, okay? They're considered the most prominent tribe. And they say, and the leader is Kalev ben Yefuneh. Remember Kalev, he was one of the original spies, and he was one of the good guys, okay? And he says to Yoshua, you know that, remember that what Moshe said to me, okay? Moshe sent me as a spy to the land, and I survived. I had to travel for 40 years in the desert, But now I'm 85 years old, right? And I still want a piece of my land that I deserve. And so please give me the mountain. Judah says, all right, Caleb says, I want the mountain. Now, the mountain was the most populated and also the most fertile part of the land of Israel. Think about it today, okay? The mountain is where there are trees, and the mountain is where there are forests, and the mountain is where there's steps in order to plant, because there are springs there and there's natural water. On the side of the mountain, by the sea, that's really hard because it's salt water, and on the other side, it's the Dead Sea. So therefore, people lived in the mountain. It's the middle, okay, of the land. And Caleb says, I deserve the middle of the land. I deserve the mountain. I want Hebron. Well, verse 13, Yoshua says Yoshua blesses Caleb, and he says, you're right, you deserve it. And Hebron goes to Caleb until this very day, and he defeats and he conquers, and he gets Hebron. And in chapter 15, it's the borders of Hebron, okay, that Judah is now in charge of. And we're going to skip these borders. And he tells his children and his grandchildren to go conquer, and they all conquer different parts of it, and they were very successful. Look how much it discusses in detail, because remember, after all, these people, this is a record of the borders of the conquest of Judah, which was a big section right in the middle. We'll call it the lower Judean hills, okay, the Judean hills of Israel. But look at the last verse, verse 63. Even Caleb, he's conquering all of Israel, all of Judah, all of his the lower mountain range. He doesn't conquer the Jebusites. Where were they? They were living in Jerusalem. They could not conquer the Jebusites. David, hundreds of years later, does conquer Jerusalem, but right now, Caleb doesn't. Now, you might ask yourself, why isn't he doing what God said? God said you have to kill everyone. And it sounds like, from the text, it says that the Judites could not conquer Jerusalem. They couldn't do it. They weren't able to. And the big question is, why weren't they able to? Now we go to the next one, and the next is to Joseph. Joseph gets the northern hill mountains. That's another, the second best area. He gives to Manasseh, and he gives to Ephraim. And look what happens in verse 10. However, they failed to conquer the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. And therefore, they decided that the Canaanites would live among the Ephraim, but they would pay tax. So now we're beginning to put the pieces together. Is it that the Israelites weren't able to conquer the land of the Jebusites or the Canaanites, or that they chose not to? Because why not just keep them there? If we can keep them there and then they'll pay a tribute to us, they'll pay a tax to us. Isn't that better? So if it's one place out of the whole country, so fine. But what if in every single tribe, in every single location, there was one little part that they said, oh, we might as well keep for tax purposes so we can have money? And that's what happens in Manasseh. Tells the story of his daughters, once again, that he was able to give his daughters land. And then verse 12, the Manasshites could not dispossess these towns, and they stayed, and they made a tribute, which means a tax, but they didn't conquer it. Now they complain. They say, "Well, you know what? It's in the mountains, and they have metal or steel chariots. It's very hard for us to conquer them." But I'm wondering how hard it was. In other words, how much they tried versus saying, listen, it's too hard, um, and we'll just take a tax from them. Verse 18, chapter 18. There was still, okay, so the story of conquest of the land is that the ones with initiative, like Reuven, Menashe, Gad, Judah, Ephraim, okay, they went and they said, we'll conquer the land. They had to go and fight, and they had to go and take the land on their own. Now, they succeeded mostly, but sometimes they didn't. But comes along the chapter 18 and says, well, there were still 7 tribes that didn't go and conquer the land. I don't know, they were living in Jericho, or they were living wherever the land was conquered, and there was a big battle that you had to do, and they were afraid, or they weren't, they were lazy, whatever the case was. In fact, lazy is how it says it in verse 3. How long, Joshua yells at them, how long are you going to be lazy about going and conquering the land? God told you to conquer it. Go do it. So, people got up and they left, and Joshua commands them that they should go and divide those remaining seven sections in those 7 tribes, and divide the rest of the. And Benjamin gets the Samaria, gets the northern part of the land, and he goes and he conquers and succeeds in conquering all of the northern Samarian sections. And then comes Shimon. And Shimon goes and he goes down to Beersheba, and he conquers that area down there. And then goes to Zebulun. And Zebulun goes by the sea, all right, probably where we are today, or I am in Caesarea, because he was the one who was going to go by the sea. And then goes Yisachar, and he has his, and he has Beit Shemesh, and he has other areas. And Asher, he has it. That's the northern in the Galilee by the Kinneret. And Naphtali, and Naphtali has his section, basically. And Dan, the final one, he has his section. And therefore, at the end of chapter 18, it says they conclude all of the conquests of the land, and the land is finally divided up. Then comes chapter 20. Now, I mentioned that the Levites did not get land. Okay, they were the ones that governed They had 6 Levitical cities, and there was something called the Arei Miklat, the Cities of Refuge. In chapter 20, Moshe already talked about the Cities of Refuge, that you have to set aside cities, 3 on the eastern side of the Jordan and 3 on the western side of the Jordan, so that if someone kills someone by accident, a person, instead of being killed by the family, which was permitted, a person would run to this kind of city called an Ir Miklat and stay there until the Kohen Gadol dies, the high priest dies. This is a law that we're actually going to read on Thursday. So I'll talk about it more for then. But this is what's set up. Joshua is setting up these 6 cities of refuge in the land of, this is awkward, chapter 20. Now we go to chapter 21. Okay. And now we're talking about the cities for the Levites. And the Levites, they were also split up in the land. They got special portions. Remember, the Levites didn't go to war, and they didn't work the land. So they needed special dispensations for where they would be able to live and where the people would be given. So that, as I said, they were given the Ir Miklat. Part of it was these cities of refuge, and certain cities around them, they were given to Levi. So that is what happens in chapter 21. And it's actually verse 43 is a nice conclusion. And it says that God gave to Israel the whole country, which he swore his fathers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They took possession of it. That's conquering it. And they settled in it. In verse 44, and the Lord gave them rest on all sides. In other words, it was peace. It was peace after they killed everyone, but okay, there was peace. And there was no enemies at the time because they followed all the laws that God said. And there was nothing, not one of the good things which the Lord had promised the house of Israel was lacking. Everything was followed as it was. So, good. Then, finally, in chapter 22, after they've conquered who they're supposed to conquer, and we'll talk about the certain people that they weren't conquered properly, and after they set up after people settled the land, and after they set up the 6 cities of refuge, and after they set up the place for the Levites to be able to go to, then Yoshua in chapter 22 turns to the 2.5 tribes, Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh, and he says to them, you followed your word, you kept your word, you followed what you told Moshe you would do. Remember, you said that you would wait. Imagine these people, they didn't go to their wives and their children for 7 years. Okay? You followed for all this time in order to, who's here? Oh, Michal is joining us. In order to, hold on. You followed everything that you're supposed to do. You kept your promise. And therefore, now God has made peace among the nations, amongst Israel and its neighbors. Hold on a second.
Ow. Everybody's still connecting to audio here. Lots of familiar faces.
Okay. And he says to them, it's now, in verse 4, he says, now you can go home to your families and go to your lands and on the other side of the Jordan River. And he says to them a very important statement in verse 5, but remember, you must follow the mitzvah and the Torah. The mitzvah, the commandments, the Torah, the teaching as to how all of the laws fit into those commandments, what what Moses, the servant of God, taught you to love God, to walk in his ways, to guard his commandments, to cleave to God, and to serve God with all your hearts and all your soul. That's a beautiful statement by Joshua in which he's telling them that, yes, we're letting you go to the east side of the Jordan, which is not really the land of Israel, although we'll now call it that, but on condition that you remain united, you remain connected to the people, and you remain one big unit on both sides of the Jordan River. And the way you do that is through following the mitzvot, through serving God, through connecting to the Torah, as you're supposed to. In verse 6, Joshua blesses them and sends them home to their families. Okay? And that's on, as I said, modern day Syria, modern day Jordan, all the way up and down the east side of the Jordan River. And lo and behold, in verse 9, they returned to their families and they went to the land of Gilad, which is what it's called. And they stayed there and they built a big altar on the eastern side, basically to parallel the altar on Jericho. There should be an altar serving God on one side and an altar serving God on the other. Remember, there's no temple right now, so it's basically this Mizbeach, this altar is a symbol that they're united, they're connected to the rest of the people of Israel. Now, what still hasn't been conquered is the land of Shiloh. I'm sorry. The people of Israel were a little nervous about this. In other words, if you're building a second altar, it sounds like you're dividing it. It sounds like you're basically seceding. So they decided you're seceding, so we're going to fight against you. So all of Israel in verse 12 decides to go to battle against the 2.5 tribes. So the 2.5 tribes got nervous in verse 13 and said, I'm sorry, they sent messengers to through Pinchas, the high priest, and each member of the tribe, and they came to Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh, and they said to them, what are you doing? Why are you turning against God? Why are you rebelling against God and Judaism? Don't you remember how terrible it was when they started worshiping other idols and they started worshiping from their own altars? And now, right now, you go home after working here and you're going to set up your own altar? Don't you remember that Achan, he violated God and he was killed as Israel? Now, what is the response in verse 21 of these 2.5 tribes? They said, what are you talking about? They said, God, the Lord God, God, the Lord God. He knows, and Israel too shall know, if we acted in rebellion or in treachery against the Lord. Do not vindicate us this day. If we built an altar to turn away from the Lord, if it was to offer burnt offering or to present sacrifices of well-being, may the Lord himself demand the reckoning. In other words, what they're basically saying is, we did this to be part of the people. We're far away, and we wanted to be connected to everyone else. So we came along and we said, we're part of the people of Israel, but we want an altar so that we can serve God with that altar. Of course, it didn't look that way, and this is exactly what Moshe was worried about, that they would do something that looks like they're rebelling against the nation. By the way, later on, and we'll discuss this in the book of Shoftim and in the book of Shmuel, that's exactly how you rebel against the people. You set up your own altar and you start your own religion and you divide. So there was a good reason that they were going out to war. But rather the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh, they said, no, we're with you. We're connected to you. God is our witness that we want to serve God. We just want to have someone, somewhere to do it, that we don't have to go miles and miles in order to be serving God. Verse 29, God forbid that we should rebel against him and go away. After all, we just spent 7 years fighting with you. Now you think we're all of a sudden gonna start our own religion? So what does Pinchas, the high priest at the time, what does he say? He said, God knows that you were with us, that you stayed, that you didn't violate, that you didn't seek to set up something new. Don't worry, you are still part of it. You're still part of the people, and you're united, and we're glad that we had to deal with this in order to, we understand that this was in order that people should understand that all of Israel is one. In verse 33, it says, then the Israelites were pleased, and the Israelites praised God, and they spoke no more of going to war against them. They all acknowledged that It's okay for them to build that as long as they have the right intentions. Next chapter 23, I believe. Many more years pass, and Joshua is quite old, and he calls all of the nations. Hold on a second. Okay, let's see where we are. Here. No, that didn't work. I did the opposite. Okay, that's making sense. He calls, at the end of his life, Joshua calls the judges and the leaders and the ministers and says, listen, I'm old. And you saw what God did for us and how we conquered all the land. And we saw that we took care of the 31 kings. And you see that God protected us, and we conquered all the peoples, and we took their land. Just like it said, just like we promised to. And the key is, he says to them, that you never forget that God is above you, that God is within you, and that you should have his name on your minds, and that you shouldn't serve other gods, and that you should cleave to God. And if you do that, then God will protect you, and you will continue to conquer other nations, and no one will stand in front of you. And therefore, this is his kind of his Sefer Dvarim, his book of Deuteronomy, his last speech before he passes away. And then he says something very important. Now, this is a key statement for us to consider. Give me a second. This is a key statement that he says to the nations of Israel. This is going to be important for us for our next study, which is the book of Shoftim. Verse 12. He says, for your own sakes, therefore, be mindful, love your God. 4. Should you turn away and attach yourself to those nations that you left. Remember that there were those nations that were left that were going to pay tax? Then you should know that they are going to turn, and they're going to be a trap for you, because they're going to be like the thorns in your side. So you made a mistake by not conquering all the people that you should have. And if you maintain your connection to God and find the proper balance, then maybe you'll survive. After all, you're doing something wrong. But in this perspective, if you follow the word of God, then perhaps you will find. But if you follow these people to whom you allowed to live amongst you, and then you started worshiping their idols, and you start marrying their daughters, then God will punish you, and then you will be in big, big trouble. You will violate the covenant, and you will serve other gods, and God will get angry, and you know what will happen? God's going to kick you out of the land. Here's a spoiler. That's exactly what happens. So, and that's how we'll start the next chapter, but let's try to finish this chapter, and then we can finish the book of Joshua. And we only have 3.5 minutes left, but let's see if we can do it. Joshua gathers all the nations, and he said to them once again, a little history lesson where it started that Abraham lived on the eastern side of the Jordan, and God brought him close to the land and brought Isaac and Jacob and Esav, and he gave Moshe and Aaron to defeat Egypt. And then God took the people out of Egypt and came to this land. And I brought you to the Amorites, and you defeated. And then Balak ben Zippor came, remember, And he cursed you, but I protected you. And then you passed, this is just a history lesson, right? And you passed through Jericho, and you defeated the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Girgashites, the Hivites and the Yebusites, and I gave them all to you. And I defeated them with plagues, and you could see all of these things that I've been able that I've done for you, right? But if you violate the word of God, if you go away, and if you do this, right? He's yelling at them. And in verse 16, all the nation says, of course we're not going to serve other gods. We would never do such a thing. After all, in verse 17, this is God who gave us this land. This is God who promised it to our forefathers. Why would we do such a thing? God is going to punish us and kick us out of the land. And Joshua responds to them and says, you better not do it, because if you do it, God will indeed punish you and you will be kicked out of the land. And they said, no, of course, we're going to only serve God. What are you talking about? So he said, well, if that's the case, get rid of all those trinkets that you have and get rid of all the people, get rid of all the booty, the spoils that sometimes have these little idols. And they said, no, it's just for money. It's just for business. And Joshua says, no, we have to make a covenant right now that you are going to follow in the ways of the Lord even after I'm gone. The video is going to go off in any second now, but I'll just speak till the end. And then we will have another class on Thursday about the Parsha. And maybe at the beginning of that class, I'll finish what I wanted to say here, because this is the end of the book of Joshua. Okay? As Joshua says, if that's the case, let's write up this covenant. Let's make sure that we understand that we are all following in God's ways, and you promise and you are accepting the covenant to continue to follow in the ways of the Lord and not to veer to idolatry and not to go and cozy up to the nations that you allowed to live amongst you just because they're giving you tax money, and to properly inherit the land as is supposed to be done. And lo and behold, verse 31 says it quite nicely, that Israel served the Lord during the entire lifetime of Joshua and the lifetimes of the elders who lived after Joshua. So for a certain period of time, they followed the word of God. And they even brought the bones of Joseph and they put it in Shechem. And then Joshua died, and then Eleazar, the son of Aaron, also died. And Pinchas becomes the new leader.